In the last video, we started to decode this chart that's about 200 years old. It was made in the 2nd century AD during the Antonine era of Roman rule. We learned how to read the coastlines and some of the place names and even figured out which is north. In this video, we're going to get into what this nautical chart tells us about the ancients' knowledge of ocean currents. One thing that struck me when I first saw this chart was the number of lines floating around in the ocean. At first I thought they were just random scribbles. But after seeing the coastline of Africa depicted in the previous video, I realized these lines actually have meaning. So here's the question. What do these lines represent? If you were to draw an arrow across the ocean, would it be showing wind direction? Perhaps? That doesn't really make sense. The winds don't blow across the ocean from east to west. The winds blow from west to east. These arrows are pointing in the wrong direction. Maybe they're representing waves, but waves move up and down, not side to side. Well, it turns out that these lines are in fact representing ocean currents. This is pretty remarkable because it means that people 2,000 years ago understood that there were currents in the ocean, that the water didn't just stay still, and they even knew how these currents flowed. This is crazy. Let's take a closer look. We'll start with this current coming out of the Strait of Gibraltar. This one is pretty obvious because we can see the current entering the strait from the Atlantic Ocean and then flowing northward along the Iberian Peninsula. This current even has a name. In Latin, it's called the Gulf Stream, though that name didn't become common until much more recently. This chart was made at a time when the Gulf Stream was known by other names, such as the North Atlantic Current or the Equatorial Current. The ancient Romans knew that the Gulf Stream was warm compared to other parts of the Atlantic. Pliny the Elder describes it as a strange warmth of water in the ocean near the coast of Spain. The Greek writer Arrian described it as well, said there is a current there which sets in from the south and continues all the way up the coast of Iberia. The next current we'll examine is this one that flows northward along the west coast of Africa. This one also has a name. It's called the Canary Current. You can see it starting in the southern part of the chart near the equator. The current flows northward along the west coast of Africa until it reaches about the Canary Islands. There it turns east and flows across the Atlantic towards the Azores Islands. Here we can see it splitting into two paths. One goes straight north towards the Azores, while the other takes a more easterly path. Both of these currents eventually merge into the North Atlantic Current that flows past the British Isles. You might have heard of another current that flows along the eastern coast of the Americas. It's called the Brazil Current. You can imagine how these three currents could easily be seen as similar. Flowing along the eastern and western coasts of the Americas and Africa, it makes sense that they were grouped together and named the same thing, the North Atlantic Current. So now we know that ancient mariners knew about these currents, and they even knew how they flowed. But what did they use this knowledge for? One example of how understanding currents could have been useful is when sailing between two locations. If you're traveling from the Iberian Peninsula to the Canary Islands, you don't want to sail directly west, because the Canary Current will push your boat back east. Instead, you'd want to sail either north or south of the current. By sailing a little farther north, you let the Canary Current push you eastward, toward your destination. Sailors today still use currents like this to help them on their journeys. So they call it a current, not a stream. The ancient Greeks and Romans didn't have accurate maps of the entire Atlantic Ocean, so they had no idea how the Gulf Stream ended. They only knew that it started in the Caribbean Sea, passed through the Strait of Florida, and then turned north near the British Isles. The reason why they thought it started in the Caribbean is because that S where they encountered it when sailing between the Americas and Europe. What they didn't realize is that the Gulf Stream actually starts farther south near the equator. And it turns out that its southern extension is actually a current that flows clockwise around Africa. Its current, known as the South Atlantic Current, is the southern extension of the Gulf Stream. Here we can see the South Atlantic Current coming around the southern tip of Africa. The green line represents the South Atlantic Anomaly, which we talked about in the previous video. You can see how the current flows clockwise around this anomaly. Here's a modern map of the South Atlantic Anomaly. You can clearly see the clockwise flow of the current. This current was known to the ancient Greeks. Pausanias, a Greek writer from the 1st century AD, wrote that when sailing around the African continent, he noticed that the ocean moved opposite to the motion of the ship. He concluded that there must be a current flowing around the tip of Africa. Other Greek writers knew about it too. Pythias of Massalia wrote that when sailing from the Red Sea to the Persian Gulf, he found himself being pushed back by a current. He knew it was impossible for the wind to push the ship back in that direction, because the wind was blowing in the opposite direction. Therefore, he concluded that there must be a current flowing in that direction. Pausanias and Pythias both sailed in the Indian Ocean, but the South Atlantic current extends all the way to the Indian Ocean. You can see how the current leaves Africa and enters the Indian Ocean here. It makes a big loop around Madagascar and then heads east. Ancient Greek and Roman sailors used this current to help them travel around Africa. This would have been very useful because it meant that they didn't have to sail directly against the prevailing winds. As we learned in the previous video, the prevailing winds in the northern hemisphere are westerlies. That means that the winds blow from west to east. This would have made it difficult to sail east in the ocean, but the South Atlantic current provided a helpful solution. If the current was flowing in the direction that you wanted to go anyway, then it made it easier to sail. All you had to do was sail with the current instead of against it. Here's a fun fact. Even though the South Atlantic current flows clockwise around Africa in the southern hemisphere, which is below the equator, the Coriolis effect causes the current to appear to flow counterclockwise. So if you were to sail on this current around Africa, you would see the current flowing counterclockwise, just like the Coriolis effect causes hurricanes to rotate in different directions in different hemispheres. It's interesting to note that although the ancient Greeks and Romans knew about the South Atlantic current, they didn't realize that it was connected to the Gulf Stream. They thought that the Gulf Stream started in the Caribbean Sea, turned north near the British Isles. It wasn't until much later that people realized that the Gulf Stream actually started farther, south near the equator, and that it continued southward to form the South Atlantic current. This is because the full extent of the Gulf Stream was unknown to the ancients. They didn't have accurate maps of the entire ocean, so they couldn't see how the Gulf Stream curved south and then flowed around Africa. It wasn't until much later that European explorers discovered the rest of the current. What's really remarkable is that people came to understand currents without any of the tools that we have today. They didn't have satellites or computers or even ships. They came to understand the complex systems of ocean currents by simply observing the motion of the water. They did this by watching how the motion of the water affected their ships. They also used things like seaweed and driftwood to help them understand the currents. When they saw seaweed or driftwood floating in a certain direction, they knew that the current was flowing in that direction as well. If you've enjoyed these videos, please be sure to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Bye.